Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our program, A Gala for Liberty, with the presentation of the Alexis de Tocqueville Awards, named for the 19th century political philosopher and author of the book Democracy in America. My name is David Thoreau, and I'm the president of the Independent Institute. We're delighted to have you joining with us tonight. For those of you who are new to the Institute, the Independent Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, public policy research organization that sponsors in-depth studies of major social and economic issues. The results are published as books and other publications and are used to form the basis of numerous conference and media programs. In the gift bag that you have, you'll find a copy of one of our books that is co-edited by our senior fellow Robert Higgs, also one of tonight's honorees, as well as our research fellow Carl Close. You'll also find a copy of our journal, The Independent Review, which has a cover article on another Gala honoree, Mario Vargas Llosa. 25 years ago, we founded the Institute to examine the actual nature and consequences of government policy. But instead of succumbing to popular and political biases, trends, phobias, or moral ambiguities, we are ever mindful that reason, free will, goodness, truth, and liberty are not illusions. Indeed, they are intrinsic and objective truths, non-negotiable presuppositions upon which human inquiry, the rule of law, and free civilization rest. We seek to explore such matters and address important questions that might otherwise be ignored, including ones that normally may be considered out of the box or controversial or politically incorrect, but may be quite critical to our understanding and in the process aim to get at real answers and lasting solutions. So we invite you to get to know us better. In the course of our work, we take special interest in recognizing individuals whose contributions are so unusual, so noteworthy, and so effective that they merit special attention. And tonight's honorees are especially exemplary. Robert Higgs, Mario Vargas Llosa, and Lech Walesa. The contributions of these individuals are not measured by fame or fortune, but solely on the enduring value and integrity of the ideas they have advanced and championed. Yet complications always do seem to creep into holding an event such as ours tonight. Many of you have hopefully seen the article in today's San Francisco Chronicle that we placed by President Walesa on the issues of protests and reform. And we're delighted the Chronicle also spotlighted our event tonight in the process. And most of you may already know that at the recent direction of his doctors, because of health concerns over recurring bouts of pneumonia associated with long-distance air travel, President Walesa has reluctantly agreed to a travel embargo on himself until sometime in 2012, and will instead be connected tonight by video to receive the de Tocqueville Award and for an exclusive interview he's done for us all tonight. We're very sorry about this complication, and he's actually doing quite fine now, but we also want to respect the wishes of his family not to endanger his health. Incidentally, when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1983, he was also unable to attend to receive it in person. His wife Danuta and oldest son Bogdan then accepted the prize on his behalf at that time. And for tonight, he has asked Honorary Consul for Poland Tad Toby to personally receive the award for him. But more on this later. Before we begin, I do want to note that in making tonight's dinner possible, the assistance of many wonderful people was really absolutely critical. So if you'll hold your applause, I'd like to thank some of these people now. First of all, we are privileged to have 30 world-renowned leaders as honorary co-chairmen and women, including 12 Nobel laureates, 2 Templeton Prize laureates, 6 former heads of state, and others, and you'll find them listed on your printed program. I want to thank the members of the dinner committee that was co-chaired by 6 distinguished individuals, who I also want to especially thank. Bob Alspaugh, retired CEO of KPMG, Bill Bowes, founding partner of U.S. Venture Partners, John Bryan, managing partner of Bryan Partners, Charlie Crocker, chairman and CEO of Crocker Capital, Tim Draper, founding and managing director of Draper Fisher Jurvetson, Phil Hudner of the Bottle Law Group, Jack Templeton, president of the Templeton Foundation, and finally, the late Bob Galvin, chairman emeritus of Motorola, who sadly and suddenly passed away on October 11th. Bob was a dear friend of the Institute who spoke at our 1988 Gala honoring Sir John Templeton. And in 2004, we had the privilege of presenting Bob with the Alexis de Tocqueville Award at a gala we held in his honor. I further wish to thank Flo and John Bryan and Freemark Abbey, who have very generously provided this really superb wines I think you're going to really enjoy tonight at our dinner. Janine Vaughn of Vaughn & Company has provided the beautiful table centerpieces. See's Candies deserves our thanks for generous donations of the fine chocolate confections. I especially wish to thank the Lech Walesa Institute, Shana Penn of the Toby Foundations, Julia Pawlowska, Jerzy Kominski of the Polish-American Freedom Foundation, Karia Tomczykowska of the Polish Arts and Culture Foundation, the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. But most especially, I want to thank Mary Thoreau, Susan Solinsky-Duryea, Carla Zuber, Sarah Tarvin, and Alicia Luther for handling the complexities of our gala, along with the entire team from the Independent Institute. I also want to thank Ed Frank, Gail Seri, Keith Criss, Paul Thoreau, and Roland DeBeck for the graphics and the videography, as well as the superb communications team of Lindsay Boyd and Stephanie Friedman. I would further like to introduce a number of the Institute's board members who are present with us this evening, and if they would please stand as I mention their name. Gilbert Collins. Gil actually just had an operation, not Gilbert. John Hagel, Sally Harris, Peter Howley, Gary Schlaubaum, who just had the operation, Isabella Speakman, Dieter Tade, Sally von Baron, and my favorite, the beautiful, brilliant, charming, and ever-loving Mary Thoreau, my wife. Before I leave you to enjoy your meal, I want to refer you also in your printed program for tonight's schedule, which is divided into 3 segments, or 3 dinner courses, with 1 course dedicated to each honoree. We will break between courses for each segment, as will be shown on the screens on either side. We will also be visited by video throughout the evening by a diverse range of a number of Gala honorary co-chairs to share greetings with us in their own words. And we also have a number of letters that we've received, and I wanted to read just a few excerpts from a couple of them, if that's all right. The first one is from Ronald Coase, who just turned 100 years old. Ronald is Nobel Prize economist, prize laureate in economics. Ronald says, I'm very pleased to take part in the Independent Institute's 25th anniversary Gala for Liberty. During times of uncertainty and self-doubt such as ours, liberty can be preserved only through clear thinking, courageous action, and dedicated perseverance, characters fully demonstrated by all three honorees. I congratulate and thank them for their hard work. I also want to thank the Independent Institute because honoring these three outstanding individuals will inspire more people all over the world to join the fight for a free enterprise economy and open society. The second is an excerpt from a letter from Charles Townes, the Nobel laureate in physics. I'm very sorry not to be present at the Independent Institute's 25th anniversary Gala dinner and celebration honoring Lech Walesa, Maria Vargas Llosa, and Robert Higgs. For all of you who were there, I wish to send you a great and enthusiastic greeting on this enjoyable occasion and send my enthusiastic congratulations and great respect for the honorees. The last excerpt I want to read is from Andy Garcia, the actor, director, producer. Andy says, "We bring with us in life the principles of liberty, and we have a responsibility to realize it and bring it to fruition. My deepest appreciation and congratulations to tonight's honorees, Lech Walesa, Maria Vargas Llosa, and Robert Higgs, who have been luminous examples of that journey, of that commitment. Through their tireless spirit and love of absolute freedom, battles have been won. Also, my congratulations and thanks to David Thoreau and the Independent Institute for giving us 25 years of forum for expression and enlightenment. In the words of Jose Marti, quote, "Liberty is very expensive, and it is necessary to either resign yourself to live without it or decide to pay for it at its price," unquote. I would now like to call on Reverend Alan Jones, who is Dean Emeritus of Grace Cathedral, who will kindly lead us in the invocation.
Let us pray. We thank you that you have called the human family into freedom and shown us its painful cost and shining glory. Help us to discern true freedom as we honor those among us who have been its champions and suffered in its cause. We thank you that you have stirred up in us the longing for liberty, grounded in a vision of the sacred. Liberty, found in our seeking the good of all. Liberty, found in the universal call to dignity, respect, and honor. Liberty, found in knowing that true freedom brings with it great responsibility. Help us reject freedom's devious substitutes, self-indulgence and conspicuous consumption, the lust for power and the pursuit of wealth, the preserving of our own freedom at the expense of others, and our mistaking it for the free reign of a corrupt and corrupting conscience. But what more oft in nations grown corrupt and by their vices brought to servitude than to love bondage more than liberty, bondage with ease than strenuous liberty. Help us to choose the path of strenuous liberty, particularly in these times of raucous politics and ideological manipulation. Give us a fresh vision of freedom in knowing that liberty can be neither bought nor sold. Help us to see that freedom is a craft, an art, something to be learned and earned, fought for and cherished, a work in progress, a gift. Above all, help us to see that to be free is to be answerable to you, whose service is perfect freedom. May it be so. Amen.
Thank you and bon appetit. Our first honoree The economist and historian Robert Higgs is senior fellow in political economy at the Independent Institute and editor of our quarterly journal, The Independent Review. He is the author or editor of 14 books and more than 100 articles in academic journals, plus hundreds of articles in newspapers, magazines, and blogs. We would now like to share a short video about this truly exceptional man who has pioneered an entire new appreciation for individual liberty and the nature of government power.
The Independent Institute is proud to present the Alexis de Tocqueville Award to Dr. Robert Higgs. For decades, Dr. Higgs has been one of the most groundbreaking and trailblazing economic historians in the world. His best-known work, Crisis in Leviathan, remains a landmark and prophetic piece of work nearly a quarter-century after its publication. In Crisis in Leviathan, he showed how national emergencies had been used throughout history to grow government and limit freedoms, and he warned that the cycle would likely continue into the future.
From Crisis in Leviathan, published in 1987, this is what you write. We know that other great crises will come, whether they will be occasioned by foreign wars, economic collapse, or rampant terrorism, no one can predict with assurance. Yet in one form or another, great crises will surely come again. When they do, governments almost certainly will gain new powers over economics and social affairs.
We've seen it happen in the past 8 or 9 years, all three of them at once.
The book Crisis in Leviathan by Robert Higgs set in motion a series of works by him, including Depression, War, and Cold War, Against Leviathan, and the new book Delusions of Power, as well as other books.
You know, I didn't die in 1988. I've continued to work since then, and some of my best scholarly work I brought together in Depression, War, and Cold War. People often say, in fact, almost everybody believes, even most economists believe, that the war got the economy out of the Depression. And what I've argued in my work is that this is a misunderstanding of what we mean by getting out of a depression. Yes, unemployment disappeared during the war. There's no doubt about it. It reached the lowest levels ever measured, just a little more than 1% by 1944. But why did unemployment disappear? Well, overwhelmingly for one single reason, the draft. And so the U.S. was a command economy devoted to military purposes during the war. After the war, when the demobilization took place, more than 10 million men were released from the armed forces in the first year after the war ended. Then real prosperity returned because the government gave up this huge claim it had on resources during the war and allowed them to go back into civilian use again, which they did very quickly and very smoothly.
Well, as a matter of fact, don't you think your thesis to some extent has entered into popular discourse, even detached from your name, to some extent?
Well, to some extent, I suppose it has. What I find a little amusing about that is that the notion of a ratchet effect, for example, was not something I discovered. Economists had been playing with ratchet effects for a while, but most of the work that was done before my book was narrower in scope. People would talk about spending ratchets, for example. Peacock and Wiseman wrote a whole book about spending ratchets in British economic history and showed that both world wars had created such effects. So I didn't invent ratchets, but I think what I did was to expand them to show that it's not just spending. Indeed, it's not simply fiscal variables. It's not just spending, taxing, borrowing. It's, more importantly, it's institutional ratchets, legal ratchets, and most important of all, it's ideological ratchets associated with the great national emergency episodes of U.S. history. And to my knowledge, I was the first one who had fleshed out the ratchet effect in that way.
Bob Higgs is a scholar of the Great Depression, and as a result of his work, he showed that in 1936-37, the economy actually started to recover from the Depression. But then FDR unleashed sort of New Deal 2, plus all the states were unrolling their own versions of the New Deal. And businesses immediately contracted because all of the rules were changing again. And they said, oh, we don't know what it's going to be like next year, so we better not invest because the rules might have changed completely and we could lose everything. So Robert Higgs calls that regime uncertainty. And in the last few years, in the aftermath of the 2008 bursting bubble, TARP, the stimulus, today if you Google the terms regime uncertainty, you just get tens of thousands of returns, most of which do cite Robert Higgs as the source of this.
In addition to his pioneering work as an author, Higgs has also served as editor of the Independent Review since 1986. He's won numerous awards for his work as a scholar. And he's helped inspire countless young people through his work at academic institutions around the world.
I doubt that anyone who's trying to teach is ever satisfied with how many people he's reached. And I will admit that I've often felt that I wasn't reaching anybody, and yet I know that's not true. I reached somebody, and I'm glad for that.
The idea that the situation we're in can be repaired merely by spending a lot of money through governments, money that these governments in most cases don't even possess and will have to go into debt in order to spend, is really intellectually bankrupt. It's a holdover from what I call vulgar Keynesianism, a body of thought that's very popular among politicians and the public, but it has practically no scientific standing at all.
Few individuals can discuss Robert Higgs and the significance of his work better than our next speaker. Price Fishback received his PhD in economics from the University of Washington, and he is the Thomas R. Brown Professor of Economics at the University of Arizona. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and co-editor of the Journal of Economic History. The recipient of the Cliometric Society Award, the Paul Samuelson Award for Excellence, the Richard Lester Prize, the Cole Prize, and finalist for the Nevins Prize, Professor Fishback is editor of the widely acclaimed Festschrift in honor of Dr. Higgs, entitled Government and the Economy, A New History. Price?
So I'm here to talk about Bob, and Bob started life as an Okie. That explains a lot. So after growing up in Oklahoma for a while, his family finally left the Dust Bowl area after the dust had settled and moved to California, where they lived in a work camp for a while. And outdoor toilets were included at no charge at that work camp. So Bob claims that ever since that time, he's lived on Easy Street because he has always had indoor plumbing, which is his one-dimensional index of economic development. He has a second dimension now after working his way through Hurricane Katrina. He actually likes hot water heaters as well, and so that's number 2. But he grew up in the Joaquin Valley. He played basketball in high school. He played basketball with me when I was a graduate student. He developed this spin move that I can guarantee you that Earl Monroe was not jealous of in any way, shape, or form. Earl of Pearl, that's right. But Bob used this spin move to much the chagrin of all sorts of undergraduate students at the University of Washington and led us to several intramural titles. But one of the things that Bob was and has become ever since is a great scholar and a great student. And he continues to learn and continues to be a student throughout his entire life and will continue to be so. Currently, he's a mid-career scholar, so I anticipate he's going to be going for at least another 40, 50 years. So he graduated from San Francisco State University just down the street. While living on Easy Street, he also went to obtain a PhD in economics at Johns Hopkins University. He went on the job market at a time when economic history was a really hot topic, and matter of fact, Doug North met him at the door at the American Economic Association meetings and offered him a job just as soon as Bob walked through the door. So I thought, this is a good way to do it. So Bob had taught at the University of Washington for quite some time, which is where I met him and where he dealt with a lot of PhD students. Then he moved on to Lafayette College and to Seattle University. For about the past 2 decades, he's been associated with the Independent Institute, and he's been editing the Independent Review, which is an excellent journal that describes what's going on. So what I want to do is describe where his work stands at this point, because I want to give you a real sense of what he's done in the fields of economics, in history, and in economic history. Bob's lifetime work has shown that freedom, liberty, and markets have led to positive developments for huge numbers of people. What you see is all sorts of different, the history of government and the history of societies throughout the world history has been one where the vast majority of governments are run by elites and they suppress freedoms for all sorts of other people. And it's only rarely, there are only maybe a handful of states that actually succeeded in breaking away from this in the 1700s, and luckily we've had a lot more states do so ever since. But Bob has done a lot to show, mostly in the context of the United States, the ways that the damages that are done by limitations on freedom and the folly of wars and the downsides of well-meant regulation. His work as a scholar, a writer, an opinion leader, an editor, a blogger, a professor, and a mentor has spread the word to large numbers of people throughout the world. He sent a lot of graduate students out who are now professors in various places, and I'm one of those people. And we've been sending more graduate students out and sending out the message as well. And so hopefully, Bob thinks he's had just this small impact on a few people, but actually it just keeps spreading. So my goal here is to give you a sense of the breadth and depth of what he's done. His first book was a book called Transformations of the American Economy. It was a very thin volume that was written, published by Wiley, written in 1971. And in about 200 pages, what Bob managed to do was predict and talk about all sorts of issues that people had not been discussing at the time, but are now central features of economic history in the way it's done today. This includes major discussions about urban areas and inventive activity that all sorts of work done by Ken Sokoloff at UCLA has spun off from. Uncertainty and its role in protest movements and how it tends to slow the economy. Shared tenancy cropping and land tenure and how it influenced the lives of black workers after the Civil War. Ethnic and racial wage differences and all sorts of different types of differences in discrimination. One of the key things he talked about was health as a big driver of economic growth and as a development of human capital. So these are all factors that a lot of people have written about ever since. And he also spent a great deal talking about, time talking about mortality and the effects of standard of living and medical care and things along those lines. So Bob, in 1971, was talking about all sorts of issues that people have just centered their research on over the last 20 years. So he's almost 20 years ahead of his time. So his second book was Competition and Coercion. It was the story of blacks from the experience from 1865 to 1914. It was part of a large stream of papers that he'd written in journals like the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, and the Journal of Economic History. And in Competition and Coercion, he tells the dramatic story of the struggles of African Americans as they left slavery and moved forward into the market economy of the 1914, and as they sought to improve their economic welfare despite numerous barriers that they faced. So here are the kind of barriers they faced. One of the key ones that Bob identifies, and it's a central problem still today, was the start. So they start with no education because you weren't allowed to educate slaves. Limited skills because you didn't want slaves to have too many skills at this time. They were stuck in the low-wage South, the lowest wage part of the country. They were stuck in low-wage agriculture. They started out with incomes that were about 1/5 of the typical income for whites at that time. And so here you have a people who are facing all these kind of problems. They're trying to compete, and they're way behind just to begin. And then what happens is you look at the kind of barriers that they faced, and one of the key barriers they faced was the fact that the governments, the state governments at the time in particular, run by elite plantation owners and all sorts of people, put all sorts of barriers in the way. Segregated schooling, such that they spent 5 times as much on white schools as they did on black schools. Even though they were separate, they were clearly unequal. Inadequate protection of civil and property rights. It's the kind of thing where, you know, a black being lynched was not unusual. And so the only way that a black could protect themselves oftentimes was to attach themselves to a white elite who would kind of be in a position to protect them. There were all sorts of attempts by fellow workers to limit access to opportunities in the labor market, and also discriminatory attitudes by just about everybody they met. So the state's blocking their way in all sorts of different dimensions, all sorts of individuals are blocking their way, yet these people persevered. And one of the things that aided them in this perseverance and allowed them to become more successful than people would have anticipated was competition in markets, and particularly in labor markets, because employers needed their labor. And there were large numbers of employers who needed their labor. And so therefore, employers started competing to hire these workers. And this competition itself actually helped to ameliorate the problem. It made it easier for workers to do better. And one of the things that Bob discovered and showed over and over again in numerous studies was that actually blacks and whites received similar wages for the same jobs in the same firm, which is something that nobody really realized at the time. The real problem that blacks faced at this point was the problem that they couldn't rise above those spots. They couldn't rise in the job hierarchy due to lack of education and due to all sorts of activities by fellow workers who were blocking them from trying to be in those positions. Because if a black worker became a foreman, white workers weren't going to work for him. And so despite all this, though, the amazing thing is that per capita incomes for blacks during this period grew at 5% per year, which is just an extraordinary rate of growth at a time when incomes for white people were going by 2% per year. They moved to better jobs. They moved to new regions. They educated children. They developed new businesses in a group economy. And ever since that time, or wherever, these kind of movements, the competition or wherever, has helped overcome this. And eventually, the state actually started to act more in favor, on their side, in a number of these cases. So this was a powerful book because it was competition and coercion. It was pointing out just how effective discrimination can be when it's backed by coercion, and how competition among other people and the ability to move from other places and to avoid discrimination actually could allow people to persevere. So the next piece that Bob wrote about, he got interested in the growth of government. And Doug North, who was a Nobel Prize winner, was very interested in how governments developed and all sorts about ideology and the role that it played. And so Bob wrote a book about the interactions between the growth of government and ideology called Crisis and Leviathan. And if you looked at America in 1900 or 1890, what you would have seen was most of the elites in America would have been saying that if we have a problem, we should not have the federal government try to solve it. Matter of fact, most of the activity that was going on, if there were regulations, they were always at the local level, sometimes at the state level. So it was much more of much less of a Leviathan than it had been. And people just didn't believe that government should play such a strong role. But we faced 3 major crises in the next 50 years. So there was World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. And Bob describes over the course of these crises how government ratcheted up. He was talking about the ratchet effect up there. And then it would ratchet back somewhat after the war, but never back to its previous level. And one of the features that went with this was a change in ideology. And this is something that Bob identified. Ideologically has become much more important to most economists now than they were in the 1980s when Bob was writing this book. So here's the way the ratchet effect worked. The crisis would hit, World War I. There's a sense of emergency. We need to fight this war. We need to win the war. We need to survive. So how do you do this? Well, it's too costly to use the market. Because in those cases, every time you try to move fast, costs are much higher. And when costs are much higher, the way markets deal with these things is through rising prices. But rising prices makes it more difficult for the government to actually fight this war. And so to try to avoid these kind of things, what would happen is they were draft shoulders, they used prices and rationing and all sorts of things along those lines. And so what Bob finally does is he talks about how this thing ratchets up like this, the war ends, the government ratchets back down again, but never back to the previous level. And so each new crisis leads to another situation. So the final thing I'd like to talk about is about World War II, because this was a central thing that Bob spent a lot of time talking about that I think is really important. So a lot of people think that World War II brought us out of the Great Depression. As a matter of fact, people use World War II as an analogy for a situation where how you can use stimulus packages and government deficits to actually stimulate the economy and make things better. Matter of fact, if you type in the words Paul Krugman and aliens attack into YouTube, what you'll see is a statement that says that we could solve the economy right now if only we could make everybody believe that aliens were about to attack, and then we would therefore build up a great military and industrial complex. So what Bob did was he showed that during World War II, in fact, it's not a good analogy for any type of war, for any type of peace-type economy to try to stimulate the economy this way, because the war led to enormous sacrifice. People's consumption was much lower than it had been before. You sent people over in harm's way. 15 million people, or 15% of the workforce, ends up in a position where they're in harm's way, and they get drafted to do these kind of things. They get paid low wages. So basically, World War II was just an extension of the Great Depression. If you really believe the Keynesian story, what you were expecting is at the end of the war, what would have happened is that government spending fell, income fell, and that would have caused consumption and investment to fall. And what Bob documented is that in fact what happened was government spending fell, income fell, but what happened instead was consumption and investment rose drastically. So the Keynesian model is just not what was described there. So what I'd like to point out to you about this is that I've finished with this last note about war and how Bob feels about war. So at one point, Clemenceau noted that war is too important to be left to the generals. In Bob's favorite movie, Dr. Strangelove, General Jack Ripper states that war is too important to be left to the politicians. In Bob's mind, war is too important to be left to anybody. So cut the insanity and let everybody keep their precious bodily fluids.
It's clear I was going way over.
Thank you, Price. Bob Higgs is a very unusual scholar and has pioneered a whole new area of understanding, a reappreciation of ideas that the founders of this country were known for. And Bob, you've been a friend and inspiration to us. We want to thank you sincerely for all of your work to advance the ideas of liberty. And to express our gratitude, I'm most proud to present you with the Alexis de Tocqueville Award. And we're looking forward to many more years of your work.
Thank you, Price, for that rather full recitation of my work in economic history. I've been in the economic history profession for a long time, so I've been able to work on a number of different subjects in that time, and Price has certainly mentioned some of the more important ones. And thank you, David, for your very kind remarks. Distinguished honorees, co-chairs and honorary co-chairs, Mr. and Mrs. Thoreau, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to have been selected to receive the Alexis de Tocqueville Award on this occasion. I've been working for many years with David Thoreau, the founder of the Independent Institute, and Mary Thoreau, the Institute's senior vice president, striving to make the world a freer, more peaceful, and more prosperous place. I wish to pay the highest possible tribute to David and Mary for everything they've done, and it's a great deal more than any of you is likely to know, to promote greater scholarly and public understanding of the values and institutions
that undergird a truly free, peaceful, and prosperous society. They've fought the good fight, never flagging, never yielding to despair, never hesitating to take the next step and the next and the next toward the goal of a world in which every human being is accorded the freedom and dignity to which each is justly entitled. Over the years, as a teacher and scholar, I've striven to uphold high standards of honesty, accuracy, and professional competence in my efforts to enlighten my students, professional colleagues, and members of the public. However, I've disdained many of the beliefs and practices common in the ranks of professors and commentators on public affairs. I have been, no doubt, too frank for my own good, and I would not be surprised to learn that many of my colleagues have found me, at least on occasion, obnoxious as a result. For one of the ways in which I've made myself obnoxious, however, I make no apology. I have forthrightly raised the banner of individual liberty again and again, even among associates and fellow citizens who esteemed other values much more than they esteemed liberty. Although few Americans openly oppose individual liberty in the abstract, it's obvious from their frequent willingness to sacrifice liberty in a quest for other goals that they do not place individual liberty very high in the rank order of their preferences about how social life should be lived. In contrast, I unashamedly love liberty. For society as a whole, I wish nothing more fervently than I wish that it should be as free as possible. For me, freedom is not simply the highest ranked value with regard to public affairs. It stands on a level by itself, far above all the others. I espouse individual liberty in this extreme fashion for two reasons, which in my mind complement one another. The first is that freedom is the optimal condition for each individual's engagement in society. To be driven, bullied, abused, disregarded, treated with contempt and dishonor, these are bad things in themselves, not only for me, but for every human being. We ought to recoil from them, regardless of whether the perpetrator is a local cop or the government in Washington. Yet all too many of us have become accustomed to such official cruelties and take them in stride without much conscious thought that they are wrongs and ought to be stopped, regardless of their source. Individual liberty, however, is also an instrument for the creation of many of the conditions, goods, and services that constitute material abundance and relieve many of the anxieties and pains that once accompanied social life for almost everyone. Virtually everyone favors economic development, especially inasmuch as it reduces or eliminates extreme poverty. Individual liberty is a necessary condition for sustained economic progress. The specific conditions of a free society, private property rights, secure contracts, a reliable rule of law, are prerequisites for the ongoing creation of wealth in the long run. At this late date, after we have witnessed the personal horrors and economic disasters wrought by socialist central planning, it should not be necessary to go on preaching the gospel of private property and the market economy. Yet we all know that many people still do not understand these essential matters and often act politically to thwart the operation of a genuinely free society. Therefore, for those of us engaged in research, teaching, and publicly disseminating our knowledge with regard to the operation of just, peaceful, and prosperous societies, much work remains to be done. Indeed, even after a great number of people seem to have achieved an understanding of freedom's importance, the gains may be largely swept away in the panic of a national emergency, when political leaders invariably come forth promising relief and protection, if only we will sacrifice more of our liberties to accommodate their exercise of new powers. Crisis in Leviathan, the title of a book of mine published in 1987, encapsulates a recurrent type of reversal in what might otherwise be a society's steady march toward greater and greater freedom. Frightened people clamor for a savior, a leader who will relieve them of responsibility for their personal security and economic well-being. This temptation we must resist if we are to preserve and ultimately to enlarge our liberties. If we do not resist, the legions of frightened citizens, political and economic opportunists, and would-be demagogues will carry the day, and the boundaries of our liberty will be constricted further with each episode of crisis. This struggle requires education, constant awareness, and the courage to think, speak, and act forthrightly among our more conciliatory fellows who would rather take the easy way of going along to get along, even when society at large is going along toward a plunge into complete tyranny or a long, steady descent into totalitarianism. Americans should not reassure themselves that it cannot happen here. To a great extent, it has already happened here, and worse things lie in store unless many more of us rouse ourselves to resist. The foregoing views, especially my devotion to individual liberty and to the struggle against everything that moves us away from the free society, explain, I believe, why I am being honored here tonight with the Alexis de Tocqueville Award. I'm pleased to accept this award on behalf of all those who share my ideals and who struggle to defend and promote the free society. Like Lord Acton, we believe that liberty is not a means to a higher political end. It is itself the highest political end. As we carry on our resistance to every idea and action that threatens individual liberty, we recognize a fact that Somerset Maugham expressed 70 years ago when he wrote, "If a nation values anything more than freedom, it will lose its freedom." And the irony of it is that if it is comfort or money that it values more, it will lose that too. I would only add that if a nation values security more than freedom, it will lose that too. If we value security more than freedom, we will be neither free nor secure. Without freedom, all is truly lost.